And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Brown.
Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be here with everyone today, and we are going to learn about some progress monitoring essentials. This is certainly a topic very dear to my heart and one that I have been working on for quite a few years. This slide shows you the content that we will be looking at today, because I want to help answer some of the questions you might have around, well, what is progress monitoring? How does it fit into a comprehensive assessment system? I'll also share the purposes for progress monitoring and then give you some examples of academic progress monitoring as well as behavior progress monitoring. We'll touch briefly on goal setting as well as interpreting progress data. And then before I hand it off for some questions, I will share answers to some of the most frequently asked questions I get about this topic on a pretty routine basis. So what is progress monitoring? You'll see this slide here showing a variety of different smartwatches. And the reason is we all tend, well, not all, but many of us have devices like this for a reason that relates to monitoring our own wellness in our daily lives. And technically, this is a form of progress monitoring because it is providing us with regular data about our wellness in relation to certain goals that we might have. And these could include how many steps we take, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. And this kind of routine progress monitoring can be done within an educational setting just as well as it can be done in wellness. And essentially, the goal is to compare student performance to a specific school-related goal. So in education, progress monitoring serves some very important purposes. One, it provides a feedback loop, and there is a considerable body of research about how, in regard to human learning, one of the most effective tools that helps facilitate learning is a speedy feedback loop. In other words, anytime a student attempts to do a task in hopefully the correct way, if that student is provided with really speedy feedback about whether or not that attempt was correct or incorrect, the student is far more likely to continue a learning process and move toward mastery of that particular learning goal. Compare this to the circumstance where a student might not get feedback on their efforts for days, weeks, or months. Well, by the time you get certain feedback, it becomes irrelevant. And so part of progress monitoring is making sure that the information is provided in a timely manner so it can be an effective feedback loop. It also, of course, will show us the effects of instruction by showing both the level of a student's current performance and the rate of learning the student has demonstrated over time. And in this regard, it can help teachers to adapt their practices for the overall goal of improving outcomes for all students. So how does progress monitoring fit into a comprehensive system, and particularly the assessments within a comprehensive system? Well, we typically think of assessments in one or two broad categories, and these include formative assessment and summative assessment. Formative assessments are going to be any type of assessment that provides regularly scheduled updates of student performance over time. And the frequency of those updates certainly could vary, but there are a variety of different types of formative assessments. These can include informal classroom activities where a teacher can observe how students are doing and adjust practice in relation to how students are performing. They could include chapter and unit tests, which are built in to many curriculum materials. Certainly, universal screening is a type of formative assessment because we gather such data typically at the beginning, middle, and end of a school year, and that shows us students' progress over the course of that school year. And then the topic for today, which is progress monitoring. So progress monitoring is a distinct type of formative assessment, and I will provide more details about its basic features and description and how those particular attributes make it an important contribution to how we can best evaluate student performance within a comprehensive system. I want to contrast formative assessment with summative assessment before we move on, because summative assessment is designed to do something very different. Summative assessments are ones that happen only once in relation to a particular body of knowledge or learning. And they are typically designed to make threshold decisions around eligibility or access to various things, or to report on groups of students. But examples of summative assessments are final exams that come at the end of a semester or the end of a school year, where there's one and only one chance to demonstrate a student's skills, and there won't be other chances. Diagnostic assessments are going to be a type of summative assessment, because these two are going to be a one-time analysis where a large body of data are collected, and these often relate to eligibility decisions. And then state tests, which are now mandated in all 50 states, are tests that happen once a year for the benefit of certain policymakers gaining information. But all of these are very different than those formative assessments, because they are done only once, and there's no opportunities to adjust instruction in relation specifically to those results. So that takes us then back to, what are the purposes of progress monitoring? And progress monitoring has a really important role in education, and that's true both within general education and special education. General education is going to refer to all of the instructional services that are provided for all students when they come to school, and for which there are no other eligibility requirements. And within general education, the place where progress monitoring would typically be used is for students who are participating in what we call supplemental instruction. And oftentimes this is also called intervention. And the reason we want progress monitoring as part of intervention is that we need a way to know if the extra thing we're doing for the purpose of improving student outcomes is working. It would be similar to somebody who decides to go on a diet and then weighs him or herself more often to see if that additional effort is making a difference. And so that helps us to see if that instruction is working, as well as support teacher planning for next steps. In addition, we can certainly use progress monitoring to support students who are participating in special education and who have an individualized education program, or IEP. And so progress data can be part of the way to evaluate the success of an IEP, and in particular, IEP goals. Goals are a required component of IEPs, and certain types of progress measures actually were literally invented for the purpose of tracking IEP goals. To that end, then those data could help with reevaluation procedures. All students with IEPs must be reevaluated at least every 3 years, and a decision about continuing eligibility made. Progress data are excellent for that purpose. And then in some states, it is the case that decisions about eligibility for special education in the area of specific learning disability are required to use progress data as a component of that eligibility decision. Not all states have this language, but there are at least 13 states that do require such data. Keep in mind, it's always important to check with your state and local rules and regulations in terms of how such data might be incorporated for eligibility. So now I want to talk about the features of progress monitoring. I mentioned at the start that there are certain core features of how we conduct progress monitoring and the progress measures themselves that are very important to the overall effectiveness of such practices. And I'm going to talk through these. There are 5 distinct features that we at FastBridge Learning have identified as really essential for effective progress monitoring practices. The first of these is that the tools must be brief. And this is because we don't want to encroach on teaching time. Every educator in America, I imagine, will tell you we do too much testing. And this is largely a result of some policy decisions, but I certainly don't want to recommend anything that's going to provide an additional testing burden for teachers or students. So progress measures need to be brief, get in there, collect the relevant data, get out, go back to teaching. When I say brief, they can be anywhere from maybe 1 minute to as many as 10 minutes, but these need to not take very much time because what we want to do is get on with teaching. Another feature is that they need to be simple. That it needs to be the case that teachers are able to administer the tools, score them, and interpret them. Because otherwise they're not going to function well for teachers to be able to know the success of efforts to help students. So they have to be understandable, relatable, and interpretable by classroom teachers, as well as support specialists, coaches, interventionists, so they can actually use the data in relation to improving student outcomes. We certainly need for progress measures to be sensitive to growth. And the reason this is the middle of these 5 features is that if a progress measure is not sensitive to growth, it's not going to help anyone and everyone will be upset. So for example, if I were to try to measure a student's progress in a reading skill, but I was using a math assessment, it's not going to work. The student will be frustrated, the teacher will be frustrated, and it's just not a good use of time. That's a very clunky example of why it's very important to align the progress measure with the specific skill that is being taught, because that is the way in which we get sensitivity to growth. In addition, that sensitivity needs to work in relation to short periods of time. You'll remember that I mentioned that timely feedback and a feedback loop are an important rationale for using progress monitoring. And so progress measures also have to be able to show that a student is or is not making change in short periods of time that could be anywhere from daily all the way out to once a month, depending on the type of assessment and the particular skill you would like to see changed. Certainly we need for progress measures to be valid. This means, do they match the student's specific learning goal? And this is the same as would be true of any type of an assessment. And they need to be reliable. We need to know and be able to see that they are predictive of future student learning outcomes. So together, all of these features are mission critical for progress monitoring, both the tools and the steps used to collect the data and interpret it. I also want to just mention another unique feature of progress monitoring and progress monitoring forms, because this is a way that they are distinct from other types of assessment, including screening assessments. In order for progress measures to meet all those 5 key features, and in particular sensitivity to growth in short periods of time, they need to have multiple equivalent forms. And what I mean by that is there will be a number of equal versions of a particular task that have slightly different content on them, but have been found in research to be of equal difficulty, so that the student can complete these tasks at those short intervals and not have practice effects. So for example, if I wanted to measure a student's improvement in reading fluency, I would want to measure that student on a regular basis with a tool such as CBM reading, which is a curriculum-based measure of oral reading fluency. If I had only one reading passage to do that, and the student read that passage once a week, every week, over many weeks, there's a good chance that the student would start to remember the details of the passage And the reading example that was gained from those weekly assessments would be influenced by what we call practice effects. The student has been practicing this one story. So instead, we need to make sure that we've developed multiple different passages with different stories, but include the same types of words and ideas so that the reading difficulty level stays the same. And typically there will be about 20 different forms of for any given progress assessment. And that's what we mean by multiple equivalent forms. And so 20 has been identified as kind of a magic number in the progress monitoring world, because if a student requires monitoring for as much time as it takes to use all 20, then the student can start over with the first one of those, and there will not be practice effects because too much time will have gone by between the version 1 and version 20. So you will see that most publishers, including FastBridge Learning, are going to have 20 different equivalent forms per measure type in their progress monitoring tools in order to accommodate the need for alternate equivalent forms. So when it comes to selecting progress measures for the purpose of helping students make progress and providing teachers with information on student progress, there are two key features that are extremely important. And I've hinted at these along the way, but these are alignment and sensitivity. And because without these, the progress measure won't be effective, I want to just take a moment to review these before I go on to provide you with some examples of different types of progress measures. So alignment means that a measure is going to match the skills that are being taught. If I want to measure reading fluency, then I need a progress measure that has the student engage in reading fluency, because then I will have an indicator of that skill. The same is true if I want to measure a student's skill with accuracy on adding single digits up to 18, or knowing all of the times tables out to 12 by 12. I need to make sure that my content is fully aligned. Also, I would want to check in to make sure that that is what we continue to teach. When a student shifts from one content for supplemental instruction to new and different content, so if a student transitioned from learning addition facts to subtraction facts, I would want to adjust my progress measure so that the progress measure in use remains aligned with the skills taught. This is the way we get sensitivity. If a measure is aligned, it should be sensitive to student improvement. And so the alignment piece needs to come first, because that's going to drive the general sensitivity of the assessment and its capacity to detect change in student performance over time. So now I want to share with you what's available for academic progress monitoring and what these look like. And then I'll also share about some behavior progress monitoring tools. Academic progress monitoring has drawn largely from a body of research around something called curriculum-based measurement, or CBM. Curriculum-based measurement is a way of measuring student performance in basic academic skills, and it was developed at the University of Minnesota back in the 1970s. The purpose for the development of CBM was to track progress of students with individualized education programs in this new system that came into being in 1975 called special education. And so researchers at the special education program at Minnesota came up with a variety of curriculum-based measures that would be able to detect changes in student performance over time. CBM can be used anywhere from weekly to monthly. And an important reminder is that a lot of research since then has shown that important not to go more than 4 weeks in duration between measuring academic skills, because any longer intervals will compromise the reliability of the data that are collected. Most of the time, we recommend that students who are participating in academic intervention will complete weekly progress measures. And if you don't have the resources to do weekly, you can go out as far as monthly, but we recommend you do not go beyond monthly or the data might not be interpretable. Now you'll see that the time required for different progress measures can be anywhere from 1 to 20 minutes. The 20-minute time slot is longer than we would really like to see, but for some skill areas, available measures right now are requiring longer periods of time. This is because the nature of what's being measured requires students to complete more items to accurately confirm their skills on that particular content. Certainly, researchers are working to reduce that time, and many researchers in the field are looking to establishing progress measures that will be no longer than 10 minutes per session. Now, in terms of format, in the original days, all of the curriculum-based measures used for progress monitoring were going to be teacher-administered, mostly paper and pencil forms. Sometimes the student would need to write some responses, particularly for math. And in the area of reading, students would be working from a paper form and reading for the teacher. In recent years, a number of researchers have developed some computer-based versions of curriculum-based measures, and these have made it easier to conduct progress monitoring because they are not as time-intensive for teachers, in part because multiple students can complete them at the same time on a computer, and the teacher does not have to score the items and then enter them into a database. They are automatically scored and saved. And this is a big time saver for teachers. So at FastBridge Learning, we have a number of different academic progress measures that can be used for conducting progress monitoring. And so you'll see here, we've broken them down in terms of what are available for reading and what are available for math. The area of reading right now, we have 3 distinct types of progress measures. One is called early reading, and early reading is a type of early reading assessment that's specifically designed for monitoring progress of students at the very first stages of learning to read. It's typically going to be used with students in kindergarten and first grade. However, it can be used with older students who might be coming to learn to read, at second grade or third grade. But it has a number of different subtests that can be selected. And when you use early reading for progress monitoring, it's a matter of selecting the specific subtest that is aligned to the skill the student's learning. So if a student is learning letter sound correspondence, then our subtest called letter sounds could be an excellent progress measure. If a student is working on specific skills of phonemic awareness, we have several subtests that measure phonemic awareness. As students go on in their reading acquisition, the assessment that is widely recommended is called CBM reading. CBM reading is a type of oral reading fluency assessment, and it is our most widely used curriculum-based measure of reading. And that's not just true for FastBridge, that's true, I think, nationally. Within CBM reading, we have 20 different passages for each grade level. And so students are going to read out loud for 1 minute while a teacher marks any errors. And this will provide information about a student's overall reading improvement while participating in intervention. Finally, a new measure that FAST offers is called auto reading. Auto reading also has subtests, just like early reading. However, it offers some subtests that fit with the skills that older students might be learning, including some subtests that measure things such as vocabulary and prefixes, suffixes, and the meaning of words through morphemes. So together, these are different tools that could be used to measure students' reading improvement while participating in intervention. We also have tools in the area of mathematics. You start with an early math assessment. Just like early reading, the early math assessment is a suite of a number of different subtests. And when used for progress monitoring, it's a matter of selecting the specific subtest that matches the skill being learned. If a student is at the stage of learning a skill such as matching quantities to numerals, we have a subtest called match quantity. The subtests do increase in difficulty and will go on to include subtests of things such as determining the least or most in an array of numbers, as well as a number of other early math skills. Then moving up in the grades, there are progress measures for mathematics that we call CBM math. And we have three distinct types of these. One is called CBM math automaticity. And this assessment provides a measure of how quickly a student can identify and provide the correct answer to math fact problems. And the fact problems are organized through a developmental sequence, starting with addition and going all the way through division. Then next we have one called concepts and applications, which is an assessment that asks the student to apply math skills to a variety of problem types, including word problems. And then finally, we have an assessment called CBM Math Process, which is an evaluation of the student's skills applying the right steps or procedures to multi-digit math problems. I'll point out that both automaticity and concepts and applications are computer-based forms of progress measures, whereas early math and CBM Math Process are ones that are individually administered or group administered by a classroom teacher. So now let's look briefly at what we could do to monitor students' behavior progress. Behavior progress monitoring is certainly also very important, and in recent years has gained more attention in regard to how we can improve students' overall behavior skills so that they know the right behaviors to use in school environments. The way that behavior progress monitoring typically works is for somebody to conduct a classroom observation of the student. And the person conducting that observation could be the classroom teacher, or it could be another educator who comes into the classroom. The frequency for behavior progress monitoring is different than academic. And this is because of how certain behaviors can really interfere with learning for that individual student and other students. So we recommend that progress monitoring for behavior be done daily so that we can track improvements in students' behavior on a more frequent basis to help make improvements and get everybody back on track with learning. As you'll see, time allocation for those observations can include 15 minutes. In some cases, there are types of observations that might be done over a longer period of time. However, research indicates that a 15-minute observation is enough to be able to adequately and accurately track a student's behavior progress. And then most of the time after conducting that kind of observation, the teacher will have captured the data in real time in the classroom, and then after the fact will enter the scores into a computer, so it makes it easy to provide reports and analysis of student improvement in behavior. FAST does offer one progress monitoring tool for behavior, and it's called the Direct Behavior Rating. This is an adaptation of a tool that's been used pretty widely in the last 20 years or so in schools called the Daily Behavior Report Card. Direct Behavior Rating is a much more customized and individual approach to mapping student behavior because each student will have slightly different behaviors of concern. that the DBR tool is available for teachers to set up individualized progress monitoring for students around those concerning behaviors. I will point out that at the present time, the FAST DBR is part of what we call our FAST Research Labs. This means that it's available for customers to use. However, it is not yet fully endorsed for standalone decision making. And this is because we are continuing to collect data about how it operates in a real world school environment. Once we are absolutely certain that it is functioning as intended in school environments, it will be released from the lab, and we will provide more education and supports around how best to use it to support students' behavior skills. Any given progress measure is going to only be as useful in relation to a goal that has been set for an individual student. And so we need to consider the importance of goal setting when we talk about progress monitoring. If we were to collect data without reference to any specific goal, there's really no way to know whether or not a student is making improvement or if it's just a bunch of data points on a graph. And in the case of students who participate in progress monitoring, usually what we're talking about is catch-up growth. This is because a student is going to enter into progress monitoring as part of some type of additional supplemental instruction or intervention, because that student needs to catch up to what is expected for that grade level. And in order for this to happen, we need to have guidance around, well, how much growth is necessary in order for a student to catch up. In the FastBridge system, we talk often about making sure that goals are ambitious and attainable. This is important because if a goal is set that's too easy, obviously the student isn't going to catch up and it wouldn't necessarily be effective. But often I've seen that sometimes goals that are overly ambitious are set, and really they are impossible for the student to reach. Because if a student is severely behind, say behind 2 or 3 years from grade level expectations, the student might not be able to catch up in the school year because it's not physically possible. And that is where thinking about attainable goals is important, so that we do not set students up for failure to reach their goals. There is a body of research, of course, about goal setting. And at FastBridge Learning, we've used that research to help create some tools where we calculate goals that start with a START score. So this is typically going to be a screening score. And then we're going to use a rate of improvement that is derived from research that we know is above average, but not impossible. And this is where we want to have an ambitious rate of improvement to help students get catch-up growth, but make sure that it's not an impossible goal. And then we also take into account the end of the school year, because we need to think about how much time is left in the current school year in order for the student to work on this goal. So all of these things are very important when we think about how we set up goals for students so they can catch up. Another way to think about the importance of goal setting is using a term that's widely referred to as the Matthew effect. This is a term that comes from sociology, but was applied within the field of education in a very famous article by Dr. Keith Stanovich in 1986, in which he quoted from the Bible and noted the famous saying, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That's found in the Christian Bible in the book of Matthew. Well, what he found in his research was that if we track student reading performance over time, and this is, absent any intervention provided, that the weak readers will remain weak and the strong readers will remain strong over time. And you can see this depicted in the graph on this slide, where the two groups of students are demonstrating parallel growth but the weak readers can never catch up unless they have ambitious goals. They have to make catch-up growth and be gaining at a rate that's faster than their typically achieving peers if they are going to be able to catch up and remain on grade level. So now let's talk a little bit about how we can interpret progress data. This is an example of a progress monitoring graph, and it just shows you some of the basic features that are important when we start to think about interpreting student progress over time. And so any given graph is going to have some data points. Those are the blue dots. And then there's a dashed line, which is the student's goal. There is a dark blue line that goes through those data points, and that shows the trend of the data so far. And then there's another dotted line that has to do with the likely future direction of student growth. Whatever it is that the student is being measured with, in this case, it's CBM reading, which is a type of oral reading fluency, will show the metric on the y-axis. And so that's the corrects per minute. That's the number of words read correctly in 1 minute. And the dates on which those data were collected are shown on the bottom, or the x-axis. In fact, at FAST, we have some additional tools that we've added to our graphs, and these are specifically designed to help teachers know how many data points are necessary so that you collect enough data to make a reliable and sound decision about student progress. A universal rule about progress monitoring is the frequency of monitoring will determine how soon you can interpret the data. This is another reason why we recommend weekly progress monitoring. We know from research that in most cases, it's necessary for there to be 12 data points in order to interpret the scores and know if a student is making progress. If data are collected once a week, it's possible to have 12 data points within about a quarter of a school year. And that's a pretty good time frame for interpreting student progress. However, if data are collected, say, monthly, it means that you would need an entire year's worth of data before you could reliably interpret student progress. Due to the fact that 12 data points is a very large number, and we know that, researchers at FAST have developed a system whereby it's possible to have as few as 6 data points in the case of certain assessments so that teachers can make quick decisions more quickly. So in this example here, you'll see that we have what's called a fast projection line shown on this slide. That's the dotted line I mentioned earlier. And that fast projection line is based on a different statistical model called Bayesian statistics, which takes prior data from thousands of students who participated in progress monitoring on this assessment to predict the likely future trend of this student's performance. And the nice thing about this method is that it allows us to have as few as 6 data points for decision making. And this is a feature that is unique to FAST. And so it means that in this case, you could know in as short as 6 weeks, or if you need to progress monitor less frequently, you could know in 12 weeks if you monitored once every other week. The big idea here is that frequency of monitoring really matters, and more frequent monitoring will give teachers faster information about student improvement. Now, in terms of actually interpreting progress monitoring graphs, there are typically 3 types of decisions or conclusions that can be reached. And those are shown on this slide. But most of the time, you're going to see data that can be interpreted as very successful, somewhat successful, or not successful. And the way you draw that conclusion will be based on looking at the student's performance as compared to the goal line. And where you have the fast projection line, that can be compared as well. because we're going to look for patterns in the data to determine if that intervention was very, somewhat, or not successful. Each of those conclusions is paired with one of three different decisions or action steps then for the teachers to maintain, adjust, or change an intervention. When you see data that shows that the students' scores are all at and above the goal line, that means you have a very successful intervention. And typically it means we want to maintain the instruction, at least until the student has fully reached that particular goal. Eventually, it might be that you will discontinue that intervention once the student's on track for that particular goal point. You may want to continue progress monitoring until the next screening period just to be sure that the student is able to maintain the goal without extra instruction. In other words, the student has made progress because of the intervention. And if we remove the intervention too quickly, it's possible the student might go backwards. So phasing out or gradually reducing intervention is typically recommended. In some cases, you'll see data that suggests this intervention is somewhat successful. This is typically observed where the student has made gains, but the gains are not strong enough to reach the goal. In such cases, we typically want to consider, is the intervention being implemented with integrity? In other words, is the thing that was supposed to happen actually happening? And there are many reasons why an intervention might or might not occur with integrity. If you have a student who's frequently absent or a teacher who's frequently absent, that could influence the integrity. You could also have other factors in terms of whether or not the teacher was ever trained to implement the intervention. So think about whether the data actually reflect the intervention procedures. Once you've confirmed intervention integrity, you could also look at things such as the dosage and the timing and pacing. Dosage is going to involve things such as how many days a week for how many minutes. Timing and pacing will include things such as what happens within a lesson, and is the amount of learning during each lesson adequate for what this student needs to learn. Finally, in some cases, there will be data that indicate the intervention is not successful. This is typically observed when you see what amounts to a flat line. And in general, in this case, we recommend that you change the instruction because there's no evidence that anything is going to get better tomorrow. However, before an abrupt change, be sure to check that integrity in case things actually haven't been implemented due to whatever reason. And then think about whether this is a student who will benefit more from an individual intervention or group intervention, whether the instruction is aligned with the skill the student needs to learn, and whether the progress measure is actually aligned with the instruction. Those are important things to consider for all of the progress data trends you might see. But when the data indicates something's not successful, it's more important to consider that because we don't see evidence of change. So I just want to provide you with a few examples of how you could apply those three general rules to interpreting progress data. So here are some progress data from the FAST measure, CBM map, automaticity. And what we see is that there are 6 data points, and the student has made growth going up toward that goal line, and in fact has already almost reached that goal line. So in this case, we would say that this is a very successful intervention. And I would want to monitor the student to see how much longer interventions needed and when it could be faded and the student could return to participating exclusively in general education. In this next example, we see the student has participated in 2 different interventions and is monitored with our early reading letter sounds assessment in English. And in that first phase, we see that the student made growth. However, it's not growth that's showing that the student's going to reach the goal. So in that case, I would say this was a somewhat successful intervention. As you can see, a different intervention was put into place, and then the student's trend shifted. We only have 4 data points so far, but based on those data points, it looks like this intervention could be very successful and have the student on track to meet that end of year goal. And then in this case, we have, again, 2 phases of intervention. During that first phase, we see that there was virtually no progress made. The student didn't get beyond 0 in most cases. And this suggests that this is not working and you got to do something different. So a different intervention was put into place. And then we begin to see some growth toward improvement. So to start with, it was not successful. And then we moved on to somewhat successful. For this student, once I have a few more data points, and if that trend continues, I would want to consider what else can be done around intensification so that the student could potentially make bigger gains. It could also be the case that the goal needs to be adjusted in relation to what's physically possible during this particular school year. So I'll finish with some frequently asked questions regarding progress monitoring, and then we'll have time for your questions. So one question I get all the time is, well, who conducts progress monitoring? And my answer always is, it depends. The one major rule that needs to apply is that it needs to be someone who's properly trained. The person who conducts the progress monitoring needs to know how to administer and score the specific assessment that will be used according to its standardized procedures. This is essential because otherwise the data will not be worth interpreting. And you don't want to spend time interpreting data that are not meaningful because they were collected in an inaccurate way. It could be that the person who does the monitoring is the person who's conducting the additional instruction or the intervention. That's convenient because that person knows where the student is, and it could be built into the regular schedule for intervention. However, the downside is that that person might not be the classroom teacher, and the classroom teacher might not necessarily know how the student's doing within intervention. If that's the case, then you could either have the classroom teacher conduct monitoring or just make sure that those data get shared with the classroom teacher. We have research evidence to show that when classroom teachers have ready and regular access to look at student progress data, they are more invested in supporting student improvement, and it can be an added incremental benefit in student learning outcomes. Next question is, what if a student's absent? Well, yes, this will definitely happen. And my advice is, if you're doing weekly progress monitoring and a student's absent on the progress monitoring day, don't worry about it, because you can catch up next week. And it's not going to totally throw off the goals and purposes of that particular intervention and progress monitoring. However, if the student's monitored less frequently than weekly, we recommend that you schedule an extra session and do a makeup. And that's because it will have an effect on how quickly you will be able to interpret the data. And you want to make sure that those data are coming in often enough at roughly equal intervals in order for you to interpret the data and then make some instructional decisions. So that's the decision point I would use around student absences. How frequently is progress monitoring regularly scheduled will dictate if you've got to do makeup sessions. Now, we also get many questions about students who are well below grade level. They need to participate in intervention and progress monitoring, and teachers are not sure what to do. We always recommend that it's best to monitor on grade level if it's possible. And that's because we want to help students catch up, and our goal is to get them within, be able to read at grade level at some percentile rank, and up to a learning goal within the grade level material. We know that some students might not be able to read or do math at grade level yet. If a student is 2 or more grade levels below, probably below level monitoring will be necessary. The critical thing with selecting that below level measure is that you want to make sure that you look at the data frequently and move the student up to the next level as soon as the student has reached the initial goal at the below level content. Because otherwise a student can look to be making really good progress but below grade level, but it is not a reflection of how they're performing compared to their grade level peers. So we have to accelerate that growth, adjust the level for progress monitoring to keep that student moving toward the grade level goal. Another question is, what about student and parent access to progress data? We certainly encourage sharing progress data with any and all stakeholders for whom there's a good reason to see it. And in fact, there are several research studies looking at the effects of teachers seeing progress data, students seeing progress data, and what that does in terms of student improvement. We strongly encourage having students look at their own progress data on a regular basis. In my own practice, I've always had students look at the graph immediately after they've completed that progress assessment so they can have a real-time indication of how they're doing. Even if they're not doing great, they need to know that, and it's because it is part of the feedback loop. They need to see where things stand so that plans to make improvements over time can occur, and then the teacher and the student have to work together on that. It is certainly okay to provide progress data with parents, and Fast-Bridge Learning is actually currently working on a new parent report that will make it much easier to do this. But again, when parents are able to see and process progress data with their children, it can be another added tool in benefiting student overall progress, because everybody can visibly see that the student is or is not making gains and then respond to that in order to improve the likelihood that students will improve. Finally, what happens when a student reaches a progress monitoring goal? Well, first of all, have a celebration, because that's awesome. And when a student reaches an initial goal, you want to think about, well, is this student still in need of intervention, or should we fade the intervention and then fade the monitoring? If the answer is the student's ready for, not needing intervention, then set a plan. If the student is still monitored below grade level, you would want to shift the grade level of monitoring so that you can get to the student up to grade level. So it depends, but overall, it's just a matter of looking at the data, using those decision rules that I showed you, and then responding with the next steps that benefit that student. So now I'm going to ask Lynn if there are questions that have come in that I can answer about progress monitoring.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. And yes, we do have a few already. If you're listening and you've been holding on to your question, don't be shy. Now's the time. Be sure to send them over through the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel. Dr. Brown, the first question we have for you. Should progress monitoring look the same at the elementary and secondary level? So for instance, the high school level.
Usually it's not going to look the same at elementary and secondary, and there are several reasons for that. So elementary and secondary schools have very different schedules. They have very different staffing patterns, and the specific assessments that you need to use might vary as well. And so coming up with a logical plan for progress monitoring students at secondary is not going to necessarily follow the same process as for students at elementary. At secondary, we tend to be paying attention to things like whether the student needs a little nudge to improve. In other words, is close to the grade level, but not quite there, in which case some less formal monitoring might be appropriate. Or is this a student who's significantly below grade level, needs highly intensive intervention, and needs very frequent formal progress monitoring to catch up? So there are distinct differences, and certainly there are a number of resources and tools available to help teams at each of those levels set up progress monitoring systems that work for their level.
That's super helpful. Thank you. The next question that we've gotten, previously you gave some examples of different types of progress monitoring examples. So for academic side as well as behavior, how is the progress monitoring assessment actually administered to students?
Great question. It depends. And so there are both computer-based as well as teacher-administered or individually administered assessments, at least within the FAST system. And so if you select a computer-based assessment for progress monitoring, then it's a matter of creating the schedule for the student to complete the assessment. And so if you were doing math progress monitoring with CBM Math Automaticity, you might schedule the student to do that once a week on Friday. The student would sit down, it's a 4-minute test, taken at a computer, and then the student and the teacher could look at results and take account of that moving forward for ongoing intervention. If, however, the progress measure that is aligned to the intervention is one that is individually administered by a teacher, then the teacher needs to have prepared materials in advance, so gathered the downloadable printable forms, have those at the ready. In the case of FAST progress measures, students will work from a paper form, for example, if they're going to do CBM reading. However, the teacher can actually enter all of the scoring information straight into a computer or tablet, and this does save time. However, the teacher would need to make sure there's a schedule for the student to sit down and do that work one-on-one with the teacher on a regular basis in order to capture that data so it would be there in order to evaluate the progress.
Perfect, thank you. Next question, is a direct behavior report considered valid and reliable?
Yes, that's a good question. The direct behavior reporting is considered a valid and reliable type of assessment. And in fact, we have numerous research studies that are listed on the Fast Rich Learning website documenting the psychometric properties of our direct behavior rating system. So if you want to follow up, you can certainly find those citations. But it is very reliable and valid. And the way it works is that instead of collecting a small amount of data across many students, you collect many data points for one student, and then you interpret those data points in relation to students' progress toward a goal and the specific behaviors that needed to change. And so there is quite a bit of evidence that it's a reliable and valid approach to progress monitoring.
Thank you. That makes tons of sense. I think we have time for one more. Do you have any resources or tools that would help a teacher set goals at the classroom level or at the grade level?
Yes, that's a great question. Fast Rich Learning has a number of tools to facilitate goal setting. In our system, we have what are called both benchmarks and norms. And within the norms tables, we actually have available for users a listing of typical rates of improvement across different percentile rankings, so teachers can see what amount of growth do kids performing at the 90th percentile make as compared to, say, the 15th percentile. Those are tools that can provide information about what might be an easy goal and what might be an ambitious goal. In addition, within our progress monitoring setup tool and how it works online, we have default rate of improvement settings based on research so that you don't have to go to those tables and look it up. It's built in. However, teachers can adjust those when they set up progress monitoring. And then we have a number of blogs, articles in our knowledge base, and other resources about setting goals for progress monitoring that teachers can access.
Thank you so much. That's everything we have time for today. Dr. Brown, if you don't mind, yes, that's perfect. For all of you who have stuck with us throughout this entire webinar series, we so appreciate you spending some time with us over the past couple of weeks. As a friendly reminder, if you are working to create your balanced assessment or your comprehensive assessment system, or if you just have questions about pieces and parts and elements in your assessment system, please don't hesitate to reach out. There's a link up there on the screen and it will come through in the follow-up email as well. Other than that, thank you everyone for tuning in today. And Dr. Brown, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a good afternoon.